So today we're going to begin to talk about the molecule DNA. You've probably seen DNA before. You've seen this diagram or this picture of this twisted double helix, this twisted ladder shape of DNA. But today we're actually going to start to talk about the structure of DNA. We've already learned a lot about DNA, actually. We've learned about how traits get passed from parent to offsprings. And we know we do that through passing on our chromosomes. Well, our chromosomes themselves are made of DNA molecules. So today we're actually going to begin to talk about the DNA and how it actually gives you your traits, how we go from having this molecule that we got from our parents to actually having our physical characteristics. To do that, we need to understand the structure of DNA. We need to understand the different molecules that make up the larger DNA molecule. So we'll get very technical with this, but we'll try to keep it as simple as possible. And understanding the structure, the shape of DNA is critical to understanding how it works. Before we get started with that, I want to go over something new, a word called a polymer, because DNA itself is a polymer. So the prefix poly means many, mono means one, and then mer means parts. So if you put it together, a polymer means many parts. So what polymers basically are is they're molecules that are made of many repeating molecules linked together. And those molecules are identical. They're made of many monomers put together. So ideally, these polymers are molecules. I'll show you a diagram of this. They're made of smaller molecules chained together over and over again. Lots of molecules in our body that work this way. So let's take an example. For example, glucose sugar. We've learned a lot about glucose. It's a very simple sugar. It's made of a ring of carbon molecules with oxygen and hydrogen around it. All you need to know is that this is a sugar molecule. But sugars often join together. And when you chain a bunch of sugar molecules together, you get a glucose molecule. You get a starch molecule when a bunch of glucose molecules are chained together. So glucose is the monomer and starch is the polymer, right? This is an example of a polymer. Many monomers put together. These molecules are chained together. The reason why I'm explaining this is because DNA works this way. Lots of other molecules that we talk about in this unit work this way. Proteins work this way as well. They just take these smaller molecules and chain them together to make one big one. So let's start to talk about DNA and how that works. And let's talk about the actual components of DNA. So first of all, DNA is something called a nucleic acid. It stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. We actually have two nucleic acids in our body, DNA and RNA. But we're going to focus on DNA today. So it stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and it's found inside a cell's nucleus. We've already talked about this in the form of chromosomes is the way that we usually see them. And they contain the genetic information for living things. Basically, it's the instruction manual on how to build and operate a living organism. And the function of DNA is to give directions for making proteins. And those proteins are what give organisms their genetic traits. Your body is made of mostly protein. So DNA is kind of like the recipe book on how to build the different proteins that make your body. And everyone has different proteins in their body, which is what gives us our different traits. The fact that your proteins are being made slightly different than my proteins. And depending on what proteins we produce, we get different traits, different eye color, hair color, etc. So a little bit about the structure of DNA. DNA is actually two polymer molecules and they're joined together. And you'll see how this works in a minute, but basically it's two chains of these repeating units and they're joined together in the middle. The monomer of these nucleic acids are called nucleotides. So let's spend a minute learning about what a nucleotide is because DNA is made up of many nucleotides joined together. So a nucleotide itself is made of three parts, and I'll show you a diagram of this on the next slide here. But it's made of something called a phosphate group, which is basically three phosphorus molecules put together. It's made of a sugar called deoxyribose, and together we call these the backbone of DNA. And then they have also a nitrogen base, and the nitrogen base comes in four different forms. So this can change from nucleotide to nucleotide. We call that the base. So DNA is made of a backbone and a base, and the base can come into four different forms. So you can see it here. Over here we have the phosphate molecule, which again is three phosphorus put together. We'll just diagram that as a single phosphate. Here's the sugar, a deoxyribose, so it's a 5-carbon sugar. And then here off to the side we have the base, and again this can come in four different forms, which I'll talk about. So those nitrogen bases, they come in four different forms. They're called adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And you don't need to actually know the chemical structure of these 4 different bases. Just know that there are 4 different bases called adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And you're going to see that pretty much throughout the entire unit, we're just going to abbreviate these 4 bases by the first letter, A, T, C, and G. So as long as you remember A, T, C, and G, you're pretty much good for here. But those are the 4 different bases that can be on each of those nucleotides that we showed here. So a phosphate, a sugar, and then one of those 4 bases, adenine, thymine, cytosine, or guanine, make up the individual nucleotides that make up our DNA molecule. And so what you're going to see is that each of the 2 polymers of DNA are made up of a chain of those nucleotides. And so what you're going to see, the monomers themselves are connected between the phosphate and the sugar of each nucleotide. So let me just draw this out to show you what a single polymer of DNA looks like. And remember, DNA has 2 polymers. This is just one of them. So here you can see our nucleotide, phosphate, sugar, base. Then here's another one, phosphate, sugar, base. And then here's another one, phosphate, sugar, base. And you can see here that each nucleotide is connected between the phosphate and the sugar molecules of the next. So it kind of goes phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar. That's why we call this the backbone. And the bases just stick out. And remember that each of these nucleotides can have any one of those 4 nitrogen bases, A, T, C, or G. Any one of those 4 can be on a nucleotide. So, like I said, DNA is made of 2 polymer chains joined together in the middle, the bases and the backbones, and 2 of those will come together to join. And that is what's going to make us have a double helix, this twisted ladder shape, because we have 2 polymers running next to each other. You're going to see that the 2 kind of make a ladder shape. Let's show you what this looks like. So here's an individual nucleotide again, and they join together to make 1 polymer. Here we have a second polymer. So this is what makes your 2 strands of DNA. 1 polymer on the left, 1 polymer on the right, and those 2 polymers together make the 2 strands of DNA. You can see that they get joined here together by the bases right there in the middle. And that's what makes this double helix shape. And you can see it here flattened out. So phosphate, sugar, base, phosphate, sugar, base, phosphate, sugar, base. And the backbone here, the base is in the middle. And those bases join together in the middle, 2 polymer strands. And you can see over here that those 2 polymer strands get twisted together to make your typical double helix shape. So this is how your DNA molecule is kind of built. Bases in the middle, the backbone, the phosphor, and sugar. Holding it all together. Now, something that's very important to note, and you might have saw it on the diagram if you looked closely, is that every nitrogen base joins with 1 and only 1 other base. So these bases have rules for who they join with in the middle. And the rule is this, that adenine only ever pairs with thymine. Likewise, thymine will only ever pair with adenine. Guanine will only join with cytosine, and likewise, cytosine will only join with guanine. So A's always pair with T's, T's with A's, and G's always pair with C's, or C's pair with G's. And if I go back to the diagram here, you can see this very well. A pairs with T, C pairs with G, G pairs with C, A with T, T with A, G with C. They always follow this rule. They always pair up with their partners. So if you have an A on one side of your DNA, you know what molecule you have on the other side of your DNA. And these rules can actually tell you a lot about DNA. They can tell you the percent of bases in every molecule of DNA. So if you know, for example, if a DNA molecule has 30% adenine, you know it has 30% thymine. And then likewise, the percent of guanine always adds up to the percent of cytosine. So if you have a molecule that has 20% guanine, how much cytosine does it have? 20%. They're always going to add up to be the same. And know that the 4 bases together always add up to be 100. So for example, if you add up 30% and 30% and 20% and 20%, you get 100%. So as long as you know one of these numbers, you actually know all 4. And so again, you can see it here, phosphate, sugar, with the bases sticking off to the side. A pairs with T, G pairs with C, T pairs with A, etc., etc., etc. There's one more thing you might have noticed about this molecule of DNA. It's very interesting. In order for the two polymers to bind at the bases, they need to face opposite directions. We call it anti-parallel structure. So one thing that we're going to talk about in a future lesson, but we're actually going to label the direction of DNA. One strand's going to run up, down, the other one's going to run down, up. The way we label it is using these numbers, 5', 3', and you're going to see 5 on the top, 3 on the bottom, 5 on the top, 3 on the bottom. The other strand will be the opposite. It'll be 5 on the bottom, 3 on the top, 5 on the bottom, 3 on the top. Don't get confused by these numbers. This is the number of the carbon molecule in each sugar, and that's what kind of scientists use to tell the direction of these sugar molecules. Just know that they go from 5 to 3. So if you look at my molecule of DNA, it's easier to understand in the diagram. If you look at the phosphate sugars over here, you'll notice on the other strand, they're upside down. So this is what we call anti-parallel structure. One strand runs up to down, the other one runs down to up. You can think of it like a highway. Each side of the highway goes in opposite directions. You can also see it in your diagram here. You could see, actually this diagram does a very bad job of it. Here you go. Phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar. This one's going sugar, phosphate, because this one's going upside down. So the two strands are running in opposite directions, top to bottom and bottom to top. So just a really quick structure. DNA is made of this phosphate sugar backbone with nitrogen bases that pair up in the middle, A's with T's and C's with G's. And then you have very strong bonds that make up the chain, weak bonds connecting the nitrogen bases, and it's got a double helix shape, a twisted ladder with those two strands paired up next to each other. And that's just a little bit about DNA. In the next class, we'll talk about how this actually works to make your different traits.